Okay, let's jump right into today's explainer, which is honestly a father's absolute worst retrospective nightmare. We're looking at a deeply harrowing firsthand account that perfectly deconstructs how a predator uses misdirection to completely infiltrate a family. We're going to unpack the anatomy of this real-life thriller, step by step, to figure out how deeply unsettling signals can just hide right there in plain sight.
We absolutely have to start with this haunting realization from the father, because it sets the entire tone of dramatic irony for everything we're about to explore. He says, "Looking back now, I can see all of it laid out like a trail. At the time, it was just noise." Man, what a terrifying admission. We're going to see exactly how small, totally forgettable noises, the everyday interactions that we all just brush off, were actually glaring, flashing red flags that a trap was being set. So to really understand how this happened, we first need to look at the family's baseline vulnerability. The mother had passed away just over a year prior. The father is now surviving on a single income, and he's forced to downsize to a smaller house in a brand new town. And that means pulling his kids out of their familiar lives right in the middle of the school year. His 14-year-old daughter is understandably incredibly angry, grieving, and totally isolating herself. Meanwhile, his 5-year-old son is just confused, constantly telling his dad that he just wants him to be happy. This fragile, incredibly overwhelmed state of a grieving family moving into an unfamiliar neighborhood, that is the absolute crucial foundation a predator looks for. And right on cue, literally on moving day, enter the neighbor, Brian. He's described as being in his late 50s, maybe a bit older, and the very first thing Brian does before they can even form a basic opinion of him is trauma dump. He immediately tells the father that he also recently lost his wife. It is a highly calculated move to disarm them right out of the gate. Sure, he stood a little too close, laughed just a bit too long at his own jokes, but to an exhausted dad, he just seemed harmless, awkward, and lonely.
But there was a momentary slip. When the father mentioned that not everyone was exactly thrilled about the move, Brian looked over at the hostile 14-year-old daughter. The father actually noted that something in Brian's face shifted, just for a second, before he smiled it away and said, "She'll come around. New places just take time." And he said this while staring directly at the teenage girl. That right there was the first subtle seed of his sinister focus. It was a brief, terrifying glimpse of the predator locking onto his actual target.
Now, it is wild to see just how quickly this trap was set over a single month. Week 1, Brian is constantly at the door bringing casseroles and fresh tomatoes from his garden. By week 2, the attention and the gifts shift entirely to the 5-year-old son. We're talking expensive dinosaur figures and remote control cars. By week 3, other neighbors are starting to issue warnings, and by week 4, tensions completely boil over at a neighborhood block party. Brian was rapidly escalating his presence, and he was using the young son as the absolute perfect misdirection. Let's contrast how the dad was processing this versus what was literally happening right under his nose. The father's perception was entirely innocent. He chalked all those expensive toys up to the fact that old men get generous when they're lonely. Makes sense, right? But the terrifying reality was that Brian was actively stalking the son's schedule. He was watering a lawn that didn't even need it, just to be outside when the boy was there. He'd wait by his mailbox at the exact second the school bus dropped the kids off. Which obviously leads us to ask the big question. Why focus so intensely on the 5-year-old son if the 14-year-old daughter was the true target all along? This is the core narrative tension of this whole story. It's the classic red herring. By focusing all of his inappropriate boundary-pushing attention on the little boy, Brian ensured that the father's protective instincts were pointing in the completely wrong direction. So the crucial turning point in this timeline is when another neighbor, Paul, finally pulls the father aside. Paul reveals that Brian and his late wife actually used to foster young boys, but none of them ever stayed very long. And even more disturbingly, neighbors started noticing that these foster boys always went quiet and small whenever Brian walked into the room, right before they were abruptly moved to another family. Paul's warning is incredibly stark. He specifically brings up a boy named Marcus, who actually ran away from Brian's house twice before the county finally intervened. Paul tells the father, "I wouldn't let that man within 10 feet of my own kids. Something's wrong with him. Keep your son away from him. I mean it." Again, notice where the perceived threat is being directed here. Entirely at the son. This warning pushes the dad right to his breaking point. He catches his son talking to Brian through the fence, and what does Brian do? He silently slides his glass door shut to hide. The father marches right over there and aggressively threatens him to stay away. But Brian's reaction is a masterclass in manipulation. He plays the submissive, totally defeated, lonely victim, which actually ends up making the father feel guilty for being so harsh. And this right here brings us to the tragic irony of the household dynamics. On one hand, you have the father's perception. His daughter is constantly slamming doors and giving him short answers, which he just dismisses as typical teenage moodiness and grief over the move. But on the other hand, you have the daughter's reality. She isn't just moody, she is experiencing acute predator recognition. She sees exactly what Brian is, and she is living in a state of constant watchful fear. Just think about the desperate, escalating ways this 14-year-old girl tried to protect her family while her dad completely missed the context. When the dad had a work emergency and almost left the young boy with Brian, she rushed downstairs to stop him, insisting on babysitting instead. When her little brother repeated a super creepy quote from Brian at the dinner table, she slammed her fork down and yelled, "I told you he was weird." At the block party, she cornered Brian herself, demanding he stop hovering around her brother. And she kept this constant, vigilant watch out the kitchen window, staring right at Brian's house. After the daughter actually confronted Brian at that block party, the father intervened. He told her to back off and assured her that he had already handled the neighbor. Her response to him is absolutely gut-wrenching. She just looked at him quietly and said, "I don't think you have." You can literally feel the moment she realized her father was utterly blind to the real danger and that she was completely on her own in seeing the true threat. After that block party confrontation, Brian goes totally quiet. No more gifts, no more fence visits. The father thinks his aggressive warning actually worked. But then, one Thursday, the daughter doesn't come home from school. By 4 p.m., calls are going straight to voicemail. By 5:30 p.m., the father is frantically calling parents of girls he hasn't even met yet. By 6, he's calling the school. And by 6:30 p.m., he is dialing the police. The tension here builds incredibly fast. The police tell the father to just stay put and wait by the phone. But he can't. He breaks protocol and drives her entire school route, which takes him right past Brian's dark, empty house, where he notices the front door has been left ajar. He walks in. He finds the whole house stripped of furniture and completely abandoned, except for one single, meticulously maintained room all the way at the end of the hall. When he opens that door, he uncovers a literal nightmare. The walls are completely covered in secret photographs of his daughter, going all the way back to the very first days they moved in. And sitting right there, on a desk right beneath those hundreds of photographs, is a single folded sheet of paper addressed to the father. This note serves as the ultimate, chilling window into the villain's psychology. It explains exactly how Brian justified his horrific actions in his own mind. We really have to break down the terrifying cognitive dissonance in this note. Brian doesn't view himself as a villain at all. He genuinely believes he is a savior. He's projecting a lost version of himself onto the 5-year-old boy. He looks at this grieving single father and sees a man who is just overwhelmed and totally burdened by his angry teenage daughter. Because of this incredibly twisted worldview, Brian actually rationalizes the kidnapping of a child as an act of mercy for the father. The total misdirection is devastatingly revealed right in his opening lines. He writes, "I hope you understand I never meant your son any harm. Boys just remind me of a version of myself I never got to keep." The son was never in any actual danger. All the toys, the fence conversations, the hovering, it was all just a prop for Brian's nostalgia and a perfectly executed smokescreen designed entirely to distract the protective father. Then, Brian turns his attention to the daughter, twisting her completely normal grief over losing her mom into a sick justification for stealing her. He writes, "She never once looked happy standing in a room with you, and you never noticed, and I did." He literally weaponized the normal, everyday friction of a grieving household to convince himself that she needed to be rescued. And then we get to the horrifying final sign-off of the letter. Brian writes, "You don't need to worry about her anymore. I'll take care of that part now the way you clearly never had the time to. Think of it as one less thing." He frames the absolute worst nightmare a parent could possibly endure as doing the father a massive favor. It is a chilling display of complete and total psychological detachment. The contrast here is just staggering. The villain's delusion is so absolute that he believes taking a child is the exact same thing as helping a parent. But the truly tragic reality that's going to haunt this father forever is that his teenage daughter was the only one who saw the neighbor clearly from day one. Her fear wasn't teenage angst at all, it was a highly accurate primal survival instinct. The source text ends with the father sitting awake in the dark, just consumed by eternal guilt. He realizes he had months of chances to simply stop and ask his daughter what she was seeing out that kitchen window, or why she was slamming her fork at dinner. He summarizes his absolute failure with this agonizing hindsight. I heard the words without ever once hearing what she meant by them.
And that brings us to the most powerful, cautionary takeaway from our source material. A lesson learned far, far too late. Harmless and a little awkward are not the same thing. We so often conflate those two things just to be polite, to avoid making a scene, or honestly, because we are simply too busy to process the alternative. But as this text so brutally shows us, ignoring that distinction can be deadly.
Which leaves us with this final, incredibly provocative thought to take away from this explainer today. In our own daily lives, we are constantly surrounded by small, forgettable moments that we just write off as background noise. But when the people we love show signs of true discomfort, when their intuition is desperately trying to speak through that noise, are we actually listening?